There are things a man does not recover from. I know this the way I know the weight of stone walls in winter, not from study, not from warnings I received and ignored, but from 12 years of carrying the knowledge in the same chest that once felt the mate bond strike and chose to refuse it. I was 28 years old the night the moon offered her to me. I was 40 now, and I had not spoken to my wolf since I sent her away. Let me tell you how it happened. Not the version I gave the council, the clean diplomatic account of a match that was never formalized, but the true one, which I have rehearsed in the dark more times than I can honestly count, testing each detail to see whether it was worse than I remembered. It always was. Her name was Sable. She had come to Ironfeld Hold as a traveling record scribe, one of those quiet, precise women who move between the border settlements, keeping histories for communities too small to maintain their own archives. She had no pack affiliation. Her father had been a scribe before her. Her mother had died when Sable was young. She carried a leather satchel of bound books, a small ink press, and everything else she owned in a pack that weighed no more than 40 pounds. She had arrived at my gatehouse in the second week of deep winter and asked to use my hold's archives for 3 days to cross-reference border holding records from the Ashenvale district. My steward had shown her to the East Wing Library. I had not known she was in the building. I found out when my wolf did. I had been walking the upper corridor toward the war room, my mind entirely on the Crestmark alliance, the marriage contract I was 4 days from signing, the union with House Crestmark's eldest daughter that would seal my northern border for a generation and bring 300 wolves under my banner. It was the kind of arrangement that made political sense. Clean, useful. I had told myself for 2 years that useful was enough. A wolf lord did not need the bond. The bond was something the old songs embroidered into a myth of inevitability, and I had watched my father's devotion to my mother leave him so utterly demolished when she died that he could not lead his own pack for 2 years afterward. I had been 17 during those 2 years. I had run his hold for him, quietly and without complaint, and I had made a decision that I believed was rational. I would not build my house on a foundation that could crack. That was what I believed at 28, walking a stone corridor in my own hold with my mind on treaty language. And then something happened behind my ribs that I had no word for. It was not a sound. It was not a scent. Not exactly. It was closer to a silence being broken, a frequency I had been hearing all my life at such low register that I had learned to call it nothing, and then suddenly, it was not nothing at all. My wolf, who had been a steady background presence since the day I came into my first shift at 14, did not surge or howl or announce himself. He simply opened, like a door I had not known was shut, turning on its hinge without effort, letting in air I hadn't realized I'd been breathing around. I stopped walking in the middle of the corridor. I put my hand on the stone wall. I said, out loud, to the empty passage, "What?" My wolf did not answer in words. He turned his attention the way a great animal turns its whole body toward a distant sound, completely, without hesitation, with the unargued certainty of something that has known this moment was coming from the first hour of its existence, and has simply been waiting for the world to catch up. I followed the direction he was pointing. She was in the East Wing Library, seated at the long reading table with 3 archive volumes open before her, copying entries into one of her own books in a hand so small and regular it might have been printed text. She wore a gray wool dress and a thick linen undershirt against the cold. Her dark hair was pinned up and already escaping at the temple. She did not hear me come in. She was absorbed, one finger tracing a column of dates, mouth moving slightly over the numbers, the entirely focused attention of someone for whom the work is the only thing in the room. I stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually do. She looked up. Her eyes found mine, and she did not startle the way most people startled when they discovered the Duke of Ironfeld standing in their doorway. She simply held my gaze for a breath and said, with composure that had clearly been her natural state long before she met me, "My lord, I hope I have not overstepped. Your steward gave permission." "He did," I said. I could not account for the quality of my own voice. It sounded careful, in a way I had not intended. "I'll be finished by midday tomorrow," she said. "I leave no marks in the volumes." I should have said good, and walked out. Instead I said, "What settlement are you archiving for?" She told me, "Greyfold, the border settlement 2 days' ride to the south." I had never been there. I asked something else. She answered it, and then I asked something else, and the conversation found its own shape, and then something happened that I have spent 12 years trying to understand, and will probably spend 12 more. The mate bond arrived, not like a strike, but like a recognition. Slow and vast and terrible in its certainty, the way you might study a landscape for a long time, before understanding that you are looking at a map of a place you somehow already know. My wrist burned. She felt it the same moment I did. Her hand went to her opposite wrist without thought, the way the hand goes to an old wound, and when she looked down, we both saw it. The silver-white mark, branching across her skin like frost-tracing glass, luminous and unmistakable. The moon's own signature. On my wrist, its perfect mirror. She looked at me, not with fear, with a clear, searching look, taking my measure, deciding in those first seconds whether I was the kind of man who would honor this, or the kind who would not. I wish I had been the first kind. I excused myself. I told her I needed to think. I left the library and walked to my study, and sat with my hands flat on my desk, and my wolf very still at the back of my awareness, waiting with a patience I did not deserve. And I spent 2 hours thinking about the Crestmark Alliance, about 300 wolves, about my northern border, about my father's grief, about everything I had built that would need to be renegotiated or surrendered if I followed the bond. I thought about my father weeping at a council table. I thought about a hold that could not protect itself because its lord had loved unwisely and lost. I called my steward. I told him to prepare a traveling allowance for the record scribe and to inform her that the library was closed effective the following morning. My steward was a careful man of long service. He looked at me once. He looked at my wrist, where my sleeve had ridden up, and the mate mark was still faintly luminous against my skin. He said nothing. He carried the message. She did not make a scene. This was the thing I found unbearable in the years that followed. Not that she protested or wept or argued her case, but that she simply accepted what I had communicated and prepared to leave. I watched from the upper window. I watched her tie her pack in the courtyard with the same methodical care she brought to her work, exchange a quiet word with the gatekeeper, and walk out the main gate into the snow. She did not look back, not once. My wolf went silent, not the low-register quiet of a wolf at rest, an actual silence, like a room going dark when the last candle is taken out. One moment he was there, his whole being still aimed at her retreating figure in the snow, and the next he was simply not there in the way he had always been. Present, but closed off from me. A wolf behind glass. That was 12 years ago. I signed the Crestmark contract 4 days later. The marriage was cordial and quiet. Helda Crestmark was a competent, self-possessed woman who understood within the first months that her husband was elsewhere in his own mind and accepted this without particular reproach, because she was too good for the arrangement, and we both understood that too. She died of a winter fever 3 years into the marriage. I grieved for her, the way you grieve for something honest and good, that never had the room to be what it could have been, and I carried the grief properly, because she deserved that, and when it was done, I did not remarry, my counsel asked, and I told them the border was secured, and the question could wait, and I had been saying the same thing for 9 years. In all of that time, my wolf did not speak to me. He was there. I could feel the shape of him, his warmth, the outline of his presence, the way you can feel a room occupied by someone who will not look at you. But there was nothing between us, no current or exchange, none of the easy communion I had taken for granted since boyhood. My shifts were functional. I could call his body and run the hills in his form, and it served every purpose a wolf lord needed it to serve, but there was no joy in it, and no him in it. Just the body, doing what it was built to do, without the animal inside it choosing to be present with me. A wolf who will not speak to his man is the quietest possible punishment, and I knew I had earned every day of it. Now it was 12 years later, and I was riding south toward Greyfold on a winter commission with 2 of my men, because the Croft-Ashenvale boundary entry had come up again in a court challenge that my own archivists could not resolve cleanly, and someone in my office had noted that Greyfold kept its own detailed historical records with unusual precision. I had not made the connection when I assigned the commission, or I had made it and then shut the door on it, with the particular efficiency I had spent 12 years developing for anything I did not want to examine. Either way, I was 2 hours south when the wind changed, and I caught a scent on it that I had not encountered in 12 years, and had somehow remembered with perfect fidelity anyway, ink and winter herbs and something under both, that had no name I had ever given it, only the fact of it, the way you know a landscape by the light it makes. My wolf lifted his head, not the glass-enclosed, distant weight I had grown used to, an actual lifting, presence and attention and awareness, and something in the quality of it that was neither accusation nor forgiveness, but was unmistakably him, the full animal I had been missing, without quite allowing myself to name the missing. I said nothing to my men. I kept my pace. I rode the last 2 hours into Greyfold with my hands steady on the reins, and a sound in my chest that was as close to a held breath as a man like me knew how to manage. Greyfold was exactly what Ashenvale border settlements looked like: 30 households, a mill, a tanner, a winter market that was closing down as the hard cold settled in, and a record hall that was, I noted at once, in considerably better repair than the buildings around it. Good shutter fittings, a new tiled roof. Someone cared about it. She was coming out of it as we rode into the square. She wore the same practical gray she'd had at 28. Not the same garment, but the same manner. Good wool and sensible boots, and her dark hair, now threaded through at the temple with the first silver, pinned up with the efficient pins of someone who has no time to fuss. She was carrying a stack of ledgers under one arm and a lantern in the other, because the afternoon light was already going, and she was finishing a sentence over her shoulder to someone inside the hall about a survey date. She looked up. She saw me. There was a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She stood still for all of it, the lantern swinging once, and then steadying in her grip, her eyes on mine, with the same quality of directness I had found unbearable 12 years ago, and found unbearable now, for a different reason entirely. Not because it made me feel judged, but because it made me feel known. Seen through all of it, the Duke's bearing, the years between, the stone I had built around everything I had refused to examine. Then she turned fully to face me, and she said, with composure that had clearly cost her nothing, or at least was not going to show that it had, "My Lord of Ironfeld, this is unexpected. I have a records dispute," I said. My voice was, again, careful. "I know," she said. "Tolvin Croft mentioned the boundary entry when he rode through last week. Come inside." She went back in. I dismounted. My men took the horses to the stable without me having to direct them. I followed her into the record hall of a border settlement I had never visited, and I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only after many years of being wrong, that the commission had very little to do with why I had come. Greyfold's record hall was warm, which I had not expected from a building of its size and remoteness. She kept a good fire, and the shelves were organized with a system I could see at a glance was more careful than anything my own archivists used. Volumes spine-labeled, cross-indexed on a running wall chart, the working table positioned with 2 lanterns, angled to eliminate shadow from the page. There was a small sleeping room through a far door. She lived here, in the record hall itself. She had made it entirely her own. She set the ledgers down and turned to face me across the table, with her hands loose at her sides and no expression on her face, except attentiveness. She was 40 years old, or close to it. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth. The bones of her face had always been precise. The quality of her attention had always been what moved me, that absolute focused stillness that made anything she looked at feel as though the rest of the world had gone quiet out of courtesy. "The Croft Ashenvale entry," she said. "Western Survey. Your office believes 1447. The Croft holding claims 1446. Yes. I have both the primary survey document and the copy made the following autumn. There was a flood that spring. The original surveyor made a correction in the primary that was not carried into the copy. The 1447 entry is correct. It would have taken my archivists 2 more months to find that, if they found it at all. May I see the documents?" She pulled them without hesitation, laid them before me, pointed to the correction notation with one precise finger, and waited while I read. She was right. The matter was resolved in approximately 3 minutes. I did not leave. I stood at the table, looking at the documents well past the point where there was anything left to look at, and then I looked up, and she was watching me, with the patience of someone who has already decided how much she is willing to give, and is waiting quietly to see what I will do with it. "I owe you an accounting," I said. A silence. Then, "You owe me nothing. What was offered once and declined. That is the moon's law." "I know the law." "Then you know that what I am now is not yours to lay claim to, on account of second thoughts, 12 years later." The words were not cruel, they were simply true, stated in the same register she might use to cite a survey date, and they landed with the precision of something that had been carefully considered. She had thought about this. She had thought about what she would say if I ever appeared at her door. "I'm not here to claim anything," I said. "Then why are you still standing in my record hall?" I had no clean answer. After a moment I said, "Because my wolf just spoke to me for the first time in 12 years. Something shifted in her face, not softness, not pity, but the careful attention of someone receiving a piece of information they have been, perhaps, half expecting. Her gaze dropped briefly to my wrist, where the mate mark had long since faded to a faint silver scar beneath my sleeve. Her own wrist, I noticed, wore the same, the ghost of what the moon had offered us and what I had refused on behalf of us both. "I'm sorry for your wolf," she said, and she meant it genuinely, without irony or satisfaction. There was no spite in her. There never had been. "I'm not sorry for myself. I built a good life." "I can see that," I said. "Can you?" She picked up one of her ledgers and opened it. Not to dismiss me, I thought, but to give herself somewhere to put her hands. "Or are you seeing what you imagine you lost?" It was the most precise question anyone had asked me in a very long time. I thought about it seriously. I thought about the 12 years, the cold competence of my political marriage, the silence of my wolf, the particular quality of waking up in a well-run hold with a good name and an empty chest. I said, "Both, I think. I'm trying to learn the difference." She looked up from the ledger. She considered me. Then she said, "The inn is closed this week. There is a room behind the chandlers, if you and your men need to stay for the verification." She went back to the ledger. I understood I had been neither dismissed nor welcomed. I had been offered the same square ground she offered everyone. Honest, nothing more, nothing less. Hers to retract at any point. I told my men to find the chandler's room, and went to find my own bed. I stayed 3 days past the time the commission demanded. On the first morning, I found her making 3 trips to carry grain sacks from the winter market store to the hall, and I carried 2 of them without asking. She said nothing until we set them down, and then she said, "The 4th is feed corn. It goes under the east bench." I put it under the east bench. We worked in a silence that was nothing like the silence of my wolf's absence. It was ordinary, the comfortable quiet of 2 people occupied with adjacent tasks. On the second day she was copying from a damaged primary document, leaning close to parse a faded entry, and she sat back with a faint crease between her brows and said, to no one in particular, "The ink has run on the date notation. The first digit is 2, but the second is ambiguous. May I look?" I asked. She turned the page toward me. I had spent enough time in archives to read damaged manuscript. My father had believed that knowing your own history was the only inheritance worth passing down, and I had spent more hours in the Ironfeld records than most dukes spend in their entire tenure. I looked at the entry and said, "The lower serif on the right stem curves left. In documents of this period that indicates a 6, not a 0, it would read 26. She looked where I'd pointed, and then she said, "You're right." A pause. "I didn't know you could read damaged manuscript." "My father spent a great deal of time in archives," I said. "He believed that a lord who did not know his own history had no real authority over his future. So I grew up reading old documents." She looked at me with something close to genuine curiosity. "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," I said. "He also spent 20 years in ruins after my mother died, because the bond breaking nearly undid him. I watched it from the time I was 17. I paused. I decided, watching him, that I would not be built the same way. It was the truest thing I had said about myself to anyone in a very long time. I had not planned to say it. Sable received it with the full weight of her attention, and then she said, "That is a reasonable decision for a young man watching his father grieve." It is a different thing to carry at 40. Yes, I said. She looked at the page. He might have grieved differently if he had believed he was permitted to live past it. I had no answer. I turned back to the shelf and thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She showed me the rest of the system that afternoon, not as a courtesy to a guest, but because I was standing at her shelves, and it would have been inefficient not to explain it. The cross-index system was her own design, built over 8 years, primary documents on the left shelves by date, secondary copies on the right, a running wall chart that mapped which documents had been copied and when and by whom, and a separate register of errors she had found and corrected in the official county copies. That register alone was remarkable. 47 documented corrections, each one noted with the original error, the source of the correct version, and a brief annotation in her neat hand explaining how the error had likely occurred. You sent these to the county office? I asked. I did, she said. 3 times. They acknowledged the first batch and ignored the others. I'll have my office right, I said. She looked at me steadily. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. But 47 corrections sitting in a border settlement's private register while the official county copies carry the errors seems like exactly the kind of thing a duke with an archival office should fix. She considered this. Then, the second batch had 17 entries. The third had 12. I'll have them all copied and delivered, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Thank you," and went back to her page, and I understood that the thank you was not perfunctory. She had tried 3 times to correct a record and been ignored 3 times, and she had kept the corrections anyway, filed precisely, because that was who she was, someone who did the work regardless of whether it was received. On the 3rd day, a proper midwinter storm came in and sealed the roads. My men and I would not be riding out until at least the following morning. I helped the settlement clear the common lane and stack the drift from the record hall door, working with the men from the nearby households, and no one treated me as the Duke of Ironfeld because they were focused on the snow, and I found that doing useful work without being watched as anything in particular suited me in a way I hadn't expected. That evening, Sable built up her fire and worked at her entry index, and I sat at the opposite end of her table with nothing to occupy my hands. At some point, she put a cup of herb-brewed tea at my end of the table without comment and returned to her index. I wrapped both hands around the cup and sat with the warmth of it. "I didn't ask you to stay past the commission," she said eventually. "No," I agreed. "I'm not going to pretend this is comfortable. I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" I thought about this carefully. My wolf was awake behind the years of glass between us, present and alive and cautious. A wolf sitting at a border and watching, not pressing, not claiming, just watching. The way a careful animal watches a door it is not sure it will be permitted through. "Nothing," I said, and I meant it. I came for a records dispute. I stayed because I didn't want to leave. I've been sitting at this table for 3 days trying to understand whether that wanting is something I should burden you with, or whether I should take it home and carry it quietly. "The burden is less interesting to me than the question of where it comes from," she said. She looked up from her index. The firelight was on her face, and on the silver at her temple, and on the scar at her wrist, pale against her skin. "Do you know what I thought about the night I left Ironfeld?" "No." "I thought about whether I was angry," she said. "I was trying to decide. I understood what you had done, not the reason exactly, but the shape of it. A man who had decided the bond was a liability, and chose not to take it when it arrived. I had read enough history to know it happened. I wasn't surprised." She turned the cup in her hands. "What I decided, that night and in the years after, was that the moon had offered us something real, and you had declined it on behalf of us both. And that was your right to do, and I was not going to spend the rest of my life in resentment of a door that had closed." "That's—" I started. "I'm not finished." Even quietly it stopped me. "What I also decided was that I would build the best life I could build with the materials I actually had, and I would not leave a space in it shaped like waiting. I do not have a space shaped like waiting. I have this hall, and this settlement, and work I am good at, and people who value what I do, and a life that is genuinely my own. I am not a woman who was preserved in amber at 28, waiting for you to realize you had made a mistake." I know that, I said. Do you? Yes. I held her gaze. I can see it. I am not asking you to return to something that was paused. I know that is not what this is. She studied me. Then what do you think this is? My wolf shifted behind the glass of 12 years of silence, pressing gently forward, and I answered honestly, two people who might have been something, meeting again when both of them are entirely different from who they were. I have every reason to understand why you should give me nothing. I've been sitting at your table for 3 days because I'm hoping, not demanding, not claiming, only hoping, that you might want to know who I am now, rather than only who I was at 28. A long silence. Outside, snow was still falling steadily, and the fire breathed. She said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I thought if you ever came, it would be with the weight of rank," she said. "An Alpha Duke arriving to collect what the moon had once promised him, as though 12 years of my life were a parcel of land with mineral rights attached." "That would have been monstrous," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "which is why you're still in this room." The fire settled. We sat with that. "The moon won't restore the bond," she said. Not a question. She knew this, as I did. The law was not ambiguous. "No," I said. "The bond was offered once, declined, and closed. There is no second fire. So whatever this is, would be chosen, not destined." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. I did not press it. I had spent 12 years in the discipline of doing things correctly while my chest was hollow, and I knew how to sit in uncertainty without demanding that it resolve in my direction. My wolf, I noticed, was still watching, steady and careful and undemanding. "I've spent a great deal of time thinking," she said, "that destiny without choice is just a very beautiful cage. What the moon offered was real, but it was also presented with the assumption that we would simply comply." She paused. "You chose not to comply. That was wrong, but it was a choice. The fact that you could refuse it means it was never meant to be taken by force." "I chose very badly," I said. "Yes," she agreed, without cruelty, "but you're not alone in that. I have made choices I'd unmake. I simply try not to make them the same way twice." "I'm 40 years old," I said. "I have a cold seat in a hold that runs well because I have been competent and nothing else for 12 years, and a wolf who only spoke to me again 2 days ago, and the full knowledge that I threw away the best chance I would ever have at something real because I was afraid of being my father. That is an honest accounting. I am not asking you to restore anything. I'm asking whether you would be willing to start from the ground and let me prove a different man than the one you met at 28. She was quiet for so long that I began to compose the way I would stand up from her table, thank her for her assistance with the records, ride out in the morning, and carry what remained for the rest of my life without complaint. Then she said, "The roads will be passable by midday tomorrow. You can stay and have your breakfast here." I understood exactly what she meant. Not a declaration, not an absolution, an opening no wider than a door cracked to show firelight, an invitation to see whether anything on the other side was worth entering for. "Thank you," I said. She went back to her index. I sat at my end of the table with my hands around my cup and my wolf, pressing warm and present against the edge of my awareness, for the first time in 12 years. Not surging, not claiming, simply warm, the temperature of something choosing to stay. I rode back to Ironfeld the following noon. Sable saw me to the door the way she would see out any guest, practically, without ceremony, and as I mounted she said, "If the eastern quarter boundary comes up again before the spring assizes, write." "I'll write regardless," I said. She looked up at me. The morning light was winter thin and very clear, and it found the pale scar at her wrist and the silver in her hair, and she looked at me with the directness I had been afraid of, at 28, and valued now more than almost anything else I knew. "I know you will," she said. Not a permission, and not a refusal. Simply, she knew it, and she had decided not to turn away from it. I rode north. I wrote the following week. I wrote about the county corrections, that I had instructed my archival office to have all 3 batches of her error register copied and delivered to the county, with a formal note from Ironfeld requesting acknowledgement. I wrote that the county office had written back within 10 days, which I expected had taken some persuading on my steward's part. I also wrote that I had visited Greyfold in my mind approximately 50 times since leaving it, and that this seemed like useful information to have. She wrote back in the same small, precise hand. She thanked me for the corrections matter, noted that the county's acknowledgement had arrived at Greyfold as well, and added, 50 times in 10 days suggests a problem of mathematical proportion. If the frequency scales with time, you will need a second mind to manage the visiting by summer. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I replied that I intended to be in the area on a commission matter in 3 weeks, and would call on her record hall if it was convenient. She wrote back, "It is generally convenient on Tuesdays." By spring, I was writing the 2 days to Greyfold, more Tuesdays than not, on commission matters that were sometimes genuine and sometimes the thinnest possible excuse, and Sable received me with the same composure she brought to everything, but she began leaving the second lantern lit on the side of the table where I usually sat, and I noticed, and said nothing, because some things are better noticed quietly than announced. Sometimes she was occupied, and we worked in adjacent silence over 2 sets of documents. Sometimes the evenings at her fire became conversations that covered ground I had not covered with anyone in years. The nature of a wolf lord's authority, and its actual limits, the history of border settlement archival law, what I believed about the Moon's Law now compared to what I had believed at 28, and whether belief that is earned through failure is worth more or less than belief that has never been tested. We disagreed on some of it, and found our way to agreement on more, and neither of us pretended to certainties we didn't hold. Gradually, I stopped constructing pretexts, because I didn't need them. We both understood why I came, and she did not pretend otherwise, and neither did I. She came to Ironfeld in late spring to consult the Eastern Archive on a long-running regional survey. My steward, the same careful man who had delivered my dismissal to her 12 years ago, who was now considerably grayer, and who had spent those 12 years watching the Duke of Ironfeld manage a hold competently and without any of the warmth that made a hold worth managing, gave her the best guest room and looked at me with an expression that said, with perfect precision, "You had better not waste this." She was at Ironfeld for a week. On the last evening she was in the East Wing library, the same long table, working through a secondary archive volume with her small, precise hand, and I came and sat across from her, and said, without the architecture of rank or diplomacy, "I want you to stay. Not as a guest. I want you to be here the way this place would be yours as much as mine, or more than mine, if you will have it." She looked up. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, fully, carefully, giving it the real weight it deserved. Then she said, "Your counsel will have a great deal to say about an unaffiliated record scribe with no pack and no title." "My counsel will manage," I said. "Your wolf's silence was 12 years. That is not a small thing." "No," I said. "It was the worst thing I have ever lived through, and I deserved every day of it." She held my gaze steadily. "You know the Moon's Law. You're not getting the bond again. Whatever we make here would be made with who we actually are. No fire to tell us it's right. No mark to do the deciding for us." "I know," I said. "I think that is the only way I would trust it." A long pause. My wolf waited with a quality of patience I had never felt from him before, a different thing entirely from the stillness of his silence. This was the patience of something that has learned to hold without grasping, that knows the thing it loves may take its own time, and will not be helped by being hurried. "My work goes where I go," she said. "Greyfold still needs its records. I won't abandon them." "We can arrange riders," I said, "or I can build a proper archive there, and find them a trained secondary keeper. I have been meaning to do it for years." "Of course you have," she said, dryly, and the dryness was warm in a way that was entirely her, and that was when I knew. She looked at me for a moment longer, then she closed her book, cleanly, precisely, with the air of someone who knows exactly where she has left off, and will not lose the thread, and she said, "I'll stay." She did not say, "I forgive you." She did not say, "The past is behind us," or "I love you," or any of the phrases that appear in stories about fated mates. She closed her book and said she would stay, and that was exactly the right amount of the right thing, and I understood it as the gift it was. That evening my wolf came fully forward for the first time in 12 years, not to claim, not to celebrate, but in the quiet and deliberate way of an animal returning to a place it had never entirely left, pressing against the inside of my ribs with a warmth I had forgotten was the actual temperature of being whole. He made no sound. He simply was there, completely, the way he had always been before I closed that door, and that was enough. The moon did not restore our mark. The old scars remained, mine on my wrist, hers on hers, faint silver ghosts of a door that had closed, and would not be opened again by anyone but us. We did not need them reopened. What we had instead was something we had each chosen with the full knowledge of who the other person was. Not the version from a night 12 years ago, when destiny had done the introduction, and I had thrown it back, but the actual people, flawed, grown, clear-eyed about the cost of the years between. Sable became the archivist of Ironfeld. She built the Eastern Wing records into the finest organized archive in the Northern Territories, and she rode to Greyfold 4 times a year to manage the settlement's history, and she trained 2 young women in the district to keep the outlying records so that nothing would be lost. The council said what it always says, and then was quiet, because she was unimpeachable in her competence and her dignity, and also because my wolf had stopped being silent, and anyone in Ironfeld who had known me for the past 12 years understood that the difference was visible in everything. She never called herself my Luna. That was a title for the bond declared, and she was clear that she would not take a title that did not honestly describe what we were. What she called herself, when anyone asked, was the archivist. What the people of Ironfeld called her, without any prompting from me, was simply the one the Duke listens to, which I thought was more accurate than any title the moon might have granted. I asked her once, in the second winter, whether she wished we had had the bond properly, the fire and the blaze, and the moon's full blessing. She thought about it in her careful way. Then she said, "I think if we'd had it as it was first offered, you would have taken it as destiny's command, and I would have been something that had happened to you, rather than something you chose. This way you had to decide every day. So did I. That seems like the correct foundation for a life." I thought about my father, who had had the bond fully and truly, and had been nearly destroyed by its loss. I thought about what he might have answered if someone had asked him whether the burning was worth the breaking. I thought about 12 years of silence and cold competence, and a wolf behind glass. I said, "Yes, it does." She turned back to the document she had been reading, and I watched the firelight on the silver in her hair, and on the scar at her wrist, and on the careful, precise movement of her hand across the page, and I understood with a quietness that had nothing fragile in it, that this, the choosing, the earning, the daily yes, was not what I had thrown away the first time. It was what I had been given the chance to build instead, not restored at all, made new, made with the full weight of what we both knew we were, and what we had each cost each other, and chosen anyway. My wolf slept easy at my feet in those evenings. He had learned, in 12 years of silence and 2 years of this, the difference between a bond given by fire and a life built by hand. He had found the second to be the better thing. So had I.